So hello everyone, and thanks for coming along today, and thanks to Joe and the team for inviting me here to speak about some of the work that we've been doing lately in the realist space. Today I'm presenting this on behalf of myself, but also our researcher from our project, who sadly couldn't be here today, Julie Duncan Miller. I think she's off holidaying and enjoying herself, but it didn't feel right to not acknowledge her on this slide because she's really the one that's done most of the hard work on this. So that's why her name's there as well. I'd just like to caveat this talk with acknowledging that I still consider myself to be very much learning about realist methodologies. I'm by no means would call myself experienced yet or an expert in this or Q methodology approaches. So what I'm going to share with you today is some of our own experiences and maybe use this space as an opportunity to open up a discussion around how realist methods are developing and what we can learn from each other along the way. Next slide, please, Joe. Sorry, Joe, thank you. So the work that I'm going to be talking about today was undertaken as part of the Impetus project, and Impetus is an acronym for Implementing Supported Self-Management in Stroke. And it was designed as a realist study to help us understand how supported self-management is implemented by community stroke rehabilitation teams, and to try and identify what works best in supporting the implementation of consistent and high quality self-management support, when it works and why that is. And these are the mugshots of our project team and members of our fantastic patient and public involvement and advisory groups. The work was funded by the Stroke Association and we finished it last year. Next slide, please, Joe. Thank you. So I'm not going to delve too deeply into the world of stroke here today, but I'd like to just briefly set the scene for how Impetus came about and why we chose a realist approach. Some of the early work that we conducted back in around 2014, 2015 highlighted that implementing supported self-management in stroke care is often constrained or facilitated by aspects of the context of the current system of healthcare in which it's either being delivered or offered to people. And so this slide just touches on some of the aspects that were flagged in that early work, including the fears and the tensions that practitioners can feel at an individual level, and also or team level, but also the factors that are operating at an external or organisational level that also shape how supported self-management is perceived, how it's valued in an organisation, and then how it's subsequently delivered in community stroke care and by community stroke care services. Next slide, please, Joe.
I think there's quite a delay.
Is there a delay? Is it flicking forward quicker at your end than it is at mine?
Yeah, significantly.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. So if I pause, it's just because I'm waiting for the slide to come up. Okay. So this led us down a path where we realised that we needed an approach which moved away from the what works question to exploring how supported self-management works, and to have an approach that would enable us to understand the complexity of what's currently happening in practice and also the impact of the variability in approaches and models of community rehab and the different perspectives of what supported self-management comprises and where it sits in existing stroke pathways. And we realised that this was particularly important if we were to translate the good evidence that we have on the effectiveness of supported self-management into meaningful and sustainable changes in practice for stroke survivors and their families, but also for our community rehabilitation workforce as well, in the way that they work together to deliver care for someone after a stroke. So we've sort of been moving through this theoretical and practical journey of thinking how we can do research differently to create meaningful change, but also to support implementation as well as reducing research waste, because there's no point in researching things that aren't actually going to have meaningful impact. And so that's a bit of a background to the work that we've been undertaking so far. Next slide, please, Joe. And these were the various stages that were involved in our project. And presenting to a realist audience today rather than a stroke audience, I'm quite grateful not to have to start with explaining the terminology of realist approaches and the various processes that are involved in theory development. The link to the protocol paper that we've published there is there if you want to read more about our overall approach. And Joe, if you wouldn't mind just clicking again, and it'll bring up a lovely box. And this is what I'm going to focus on today, which is the Q methodology work that we undertook as part of this project and how we drew in this approach and how we utilised the data from that within this realist framework to help us to define and prioritise the initial programme theories that we had identified from the earlier review work. Next slide, please, Joe. So before I go into a bit of an introduction to Q methodology for those of us who are unfamiliar with the approach, I wanted to just touch on why we adopted this approach in the first place. All of us here will be familiar with the fact that stakeholder involvement is such a core part of theory development. And I suppose our decision to use Q methodology was both methodological and practical, but also threefold, really. So we had assumed quite correctly, as it turns out, that we may encounter a large volume of data and a vast array of initial programme theory ideas. And so we wanted to have some kind of robust system in place where we could more easily prioritise those ideas. Given that there's this lack of cohesion and a lack of consensus about what supported self-management in stroke is, and a lack of clarity about its programme architecture or what its components are, what it involves, we wanted to use an approach like Q methodology to try and get a sense about shared views on what supported self-management as an intervention or bundle of interventions looked like, what it involved, and to try and get some clarity on this, which we hoped would help us to refine our ideas about how supported self-management works and how we could frame and articulate these as programme theories and CMO strings. The other thing is that we thought this could be valuable in helping us to programme strategies from potential mechanisms of action. And as I'll come on to talk about, that's something that initially we were quite confused about. What was the intervention strategy? What was the mechanism? And finally, we had Q expertise sitting on our doorstep with the wonderful Eunice team at GCU. And I think Helen is here today from that team. There might be others. And it seemed like an opportune time to bring some of that work together, some of these methods together in our expertise. And they're a bloody lovely team to work with, and you can't get better than that. And as I get further into academia in my career, I've realised that it's really about who you work with and having people that you can work alongside. I think that always helps. And I've added the link to the GCU web pages there for some of the Eunice team's work. They offer workshops, they've got some training as well, if anyone is interested. And that's just a bit of a free plug for them. Next slide, please, Joe. So I want to say that our decision to use Q was entirely based on a desire to drive forward methodological knowledge and innovation in realist approaches, but it was actually a little bit more pragmatic than that. Nonetheless, from our reading and our discussions with people early on at Justin's realist evaluation training courses, for example, we got the opportunity to chat with Kev about this. And I think we then realised the novel and important contribution of this to the field of realist work early on. To our knowledge, there's only a handful of realist studies that are incorporating Q methodology at the moment. Kev Harris's work is probably the most well known, but there's also the ongoing Community Health Assets project that's being led by Rachel Baker and the Eunice team at GCU, and Helen is also involved in that. And so with the development of realist approaches being at that early stage of relative immaturity, and one in which we're actively encouraged to experiment with new approaches that add or facilitate that ontological depth, and where we can use approaches that will help with the delineation of mechanisms and contexts. I guess to some extent we're still exploring and flexing the ways in which something like Q methodology can be combined with realist approaches, and we're still learning about the benefits and the challenges of this. So I'm really pleased that we're able to contribute something towards this discussion today, and really looking forward to hearing others' viewpoints on and their experiences of using Q and where we go to next. Next slide, please, Jo. For those of you unfamiliar with the approach of Q methodology, I'm going to attempt to provide a very short summary of what it is and how it's undertaken. And I might defer to my fab colleague Helen here, who will be far more suitably qualified to add any extra detail or answer any advanced questions that you might have on Q methods, but I will try to do my best. So Q methodology is a mixed methods approach, and it combines qualitative and quantitative techniques to study subjective opinions and to identify areas of similarities or differences, in this case around the topic of supported self-management. And I have to say, I really quite like Kev's articulation of this as a quali-quantological approach. I thought that was quite nice. And Kev, I don't know if that's one that you've come up with yourself or taken from somewhere, but I really quite like that. So thank you for that contribution. It has two main stages. So data collection, which is referred to by the term Q-sort. And that involves a series of cards that contain statements that participants are then asked to rank order in terms of how much they agree or disagree with each statement. Or in this case, we asked participants how important they thought each of the statements were. And they place these on a grid like the one in the picture there, with the most and the least important statements being placed at the outer edges of the grid and working in towards the centre for those that they feel more neutral about. It's important probably to stress that participants will often find all of the statements important because they come from the knowledge, the evidence base, which we refer to as a concourse. And so all of those views are important, but this approach forces them into a very nuanced way of thinking about what really are the most important priority statements if they had to choose. And Q methodology has previously been used, and Helen can tell us more about this, I'm sure, to address some of the very complex and sensitive issues that they deal with in health economics, like prioritising funding for health and social care services, or preferences for care and healthcare spending for people with terminal illness or at the end of life. So used to dealing with very sensitive, polarised views, or where these might be quite emotive. Participants are then asked to some follow-up questions in a post-ranking interview to understand more about their overall viewpoints and to explore more of their reasons for where they've positioned the cards and why. In our case, we undertook this using a written template, but also had a verbal discussion as well, which we audio recorded, and I'll say a bit more about that in just a little bit. Second stage is analysis, and this final square, the final picture on this slide, shows the output of that analysis, what that looks like. And that involves using a statistical Q software package to undertake what's called factor analysis on that Q-sort data. And that statistical process is essentially helping to identify how many different ways the Q statements are organised, and therefore how many different composite Q sorts or factors there are. And factors are essentially a Q sort, referred to as a factor array, which best represents the configuration of Q statements, statistically grouped together by participants who have each created a similar sort of Q sort structure in their data collection. The analysis of the factors helps to identify where there are statements representing views or experiences that are most prominent within a group, but also those that differ significantly from where they're positioned in some of the other factors that are produced that other participants in the study might load onto. The statistical analysis and the qualitative comments from the follow-up interview are then used to provide an overall description of what that factor is saying. And in this case, that was about what was important to making supported self-management work well. And the descriptions can then be compared for their key differences, and that helps us to form an understanding about the range of differing, but also the shared views on a topic. Next slide, please, Jo. So on to what we did and how we set up our Q study. And this is probably one of the key discussion points, I think, for this talk today. we consider the Q methodology to be a central part of our programme theory development, which I think is broadly similar to what Kev has done in his work. However, it's maybe slightly different to what the GCU-led team in the Community Health Assets project are doing. I think they're using Q in the testing phase, and Helen, you can correct me if I'm wrong with that. So the first step for us was to develop the Q-sort statements, and we spent a lot of time trying to decide what the cards should look like, whether they should have a full CMO statement on them or present more broadly a general sense of the different ideas that we'd found from the literature relating to strategies for supported self-management and potential contexts and mechanisms and outcomes that we'd identified. We felt at this stage that although having undertaken the review, we had an initial sense of what some of the CMOs might be. In fact, we started out with 78 potential CMO statements at that point, but some of these overlapped and some of them were at different levels. For example, some of them related to an individual level, some of them were focused on how the team or organisation might work and mechanisms and contexts that work there. And some were still more abstract ideas at this stage. And we often find ourselves going back and forward trying to disentangle mechanisms from context and coming up with a few different ideas on the direction of how we thought the CMO played out. So we felt at this stage that we maybe didn't have that clarity or certainty. So in the end, we decided that we'd go with the option of the general ideas rather than CMO statements. We got the first list down from 78 potential ideas and statements down to 46, which we then mapped onto 5 initial programme theory areas that we had at that stage. And then we took those to our PPI group and discussed their thoughts on those. And the PPI discussions led to some rewording of the statements. So you can see some of these statements on the cards here. That's how they looked. And the grid here is the grid that we then kind of got printed in large size and then asked people to place the cards on these. So some of the rewording, for example, in one case we had a statement that was restores self-worth and self-belief. And our PPI discussions led us to change that to builds self-worth and self-belief. So it was just about clarity for that. We also removed some of the statements that didn't seem to align with the overall Q question about what was important to making supported self-management work. For example, one of those was everybody has the opportunity to access supported self-management, which came through really strongly from the literature, but it then didn't really seem to explain how and why supported self-management might work. And so we removed that. And then we also amalgamated any remaining statements that appeared to be overlapping or similar. So, for example, we had 2 statements related to power and decision making. And these were combined to read power and decision making is shared equally between professionals and stroke survivors. And this got us down to a final list of 32 statements. So it was a bit of work, and it sounds really simple to say we got from that to this to that, but as I'm sure all of you who are immersed in the world of realist work alone, you'll know the amount of intensive work that it takes to get those ideas down, and it did take a bit of an intensive work. We were aware at this point that we still didn't want to be in a position where we were awash with loads of different CMOs. So these were then, our statements that we had here were then reviewed by 2 members of our project team who hadn't already been involved in the discussions and the development of the Q-sort, to have that kind of independent check about whether that sounded okay, whether they mapped onto the programme theory ideas in the way that we thought that they did. So we had that kind of sense check built in at that point. We then typed up these shorter statements because we also had to fit them onto a card. And then we cut out all the cards and got the templates printed out for the grids. And then we were all ready to use those for the data collection. And before we did the data collection, we also piloted the whole of the Q data collection process with our PPI members and 2 clinicians who we worked with, but who weren't part of the project. Next slide, please, Jo. So in the pilot, we wanted to be sure that our preceding information and our instructions were accurate and comprehensible as well, and that people were able to understand what they were being asked to do and be able to position the cards accordingly. So we actually had a lot of work, not just about developing the cue sort itself, but actually developing the materials to go alongside that, whether that was information sheets, whether it was show cards, whether it was instructions for Julie as the researcher and a script about what she would do during the process. So there was a lot of that that went alongside this. And from the experiences from the PPI group in using the cue, doing the cue for us, they didn't feel that anything was missing. But that also gave us an opportunity, which was quite valuable, to see how long it could take people to complete them and get a sense, bearing in mind that this might have been a new method of data collection for people, but also some of the stroke survivors who were involved might require more time just because of cognitive or communicative impairments that they were experiencing. Next slide, please, Jo. The P-set is something I haven't talked much about yet. I think that's changed, yep. And P-set refers to the participants in the cue methodology study. So our participants with cue methodology study, and in fact the later testing phase of the larger Realist project as well, included stroke survivors, community-based rehabilitation practitioners, and that included physiotherapists, occupational therapists, nurses, speech and language therapists, and clinical psychologists. And we also involved people who were working at the clinical lead or manager level across 4 health boards. The 4 health boards that we chose were specifically chosen as case study sites because they offered a mix of different rehabilitation models. They had different teams with different skill mixes and different types of staff in them. And they also covered different geographies. So for example, we had that mix of urban and rural areas in there. Next slide, please, Jo. And our cue methodology study was completed just before COVID hit. So thankfully, we were fortunate enough to be able to do it face-to-face with individuals and community teams. And I don't know if anybody on the call, and indeed Helen, might have some experience of this and her team of doing cue virtually online. Fortunately, we didn't have to tackle that particular challenge, but I'd be really interested to hear how you do that for future. So participants were asked to rank order the cards from most to least important based on the question that we gave them, the instruction question, which was what's most important in making supported self-management work. Participants took quite a bit of time over this, and as expected, all of the statements were important to them. And sometimes for them it involved some initial positioning before moving things around into their final positioning. So they did a bit of reflection after they positioned things and decided that actually they wanted to change those around. The community teams did this in a group. Some of them worked closely together. Some of them didn't work closely together, just if they were covering a larger geographical area, for example. So some of them knew each other, some of them didn't know each other very well, but they did this without conversing about the statements and their thoughts at that time. And then the stroke survivors and the managers did this one-to-one with Julie. At the end of the sorting process, we asked participants to write some notes on the word template that's shown here, where we asked them to add if anything was missing, but then also asked them to explain their reasons for the positioning of the cards that were placed in the top 2 and the top 2 and the top 2 bottom positions, indicating the statements that they'd rank most and least important. They were then asked to make some further comments about any of the other statements that they placed on the grid thereafter. And then after that, we had an informal and audio recorded discussion with them to capture individuals or the group's thoughts on the statements in a bit more depth. Next slide, please, Jo. And just for interest, the factor analysis revealed that participants in the study shared views that could be aligned to one of 4 broad perspectives on what supported self-management was and what was most important for making it work or a success. These factors were developed through a combination of the statistical analysis of the positioning of the statements, but also the explanations that have been provided by participants and their comments in the follow-up interviews. And that helped to add more explanatory power, more depth and interpretation. And the factors are shown here, and they included a person-centred approach to building self-confidence and self-worth. And that emphasised the importance of supported self-management being this person-centred approach that needs to focus on the individual's needs and meaningful goals to make it work, and building stroke survivors' confidence in their abilities to self-manage. Building a sense of hope and restoring their self-worth was also important in this factor, and that was important for making supported self-management work. The second factor was feeling heard, understood and supported by everybody, and that emphasised the importance of listening to stroke survivors, and that supported self-management worked well when it instilled that sense of feeling cared for and supported, which could come from a variety of sources, including partners, spouses, healthcare professionals, friends and local community groups. Factor 3 was about training, preparation and appropriate resources. And that emphasised the need for service-wide scaffolding of practical resources to be put in place to make it work, such as dedicated time, preparation or training for self-management. And what was really interesting was in the follow-up discussions, they revealed that where people talked about a context where there was little value being placed on developing a supportive culture towards supported self-management, or where stroke wasn't perhaps viewed as a healthcare priority in their board, or maybe where they covered that vast geographical area and perhaps didn't have as close-knit links with their team members, they were more likely to highlight the need and load onto this factor, almost about training and resources being important. And the final factor was right thing, right place at the right time for the individual. And that emphasised that supported self-management works best when support is provided when stroke survivors need it most, and when professionals understand the needs of the individual and can therefore tailor the provision of support accordingly to that. And again, just like Realist work itself, the development of these narratives, naming them into something suitable, that was clear, that was appropriate, was an iterative process that involved multiple rounds of developing a description, reflecting on that and reviewing that. And myself and Julie and Helen were largely involved in that kind of process. And then sharing that with the full project team and our PPI groups for their comments, for their reflections on that, rewriting the descriptions where we needed to, and then identifying potential factor labels and voting on those until we'd finally settled on a narrative that the research and the PPI teams felt comfortable with. And you can see a link here to the paper that Julie led on the publication of, which was just focusing on the Q methodology findings. So that one doesn't then start to talk about how we embed that within a Realist framework, although it does mention that it's part of that larger process. Next slide, please, Jo. And at this point, sorry, Jo, you'll need to click a few times, maybe just once, actually. I think they all follow each other. Thank you. So it was at this point that I think we started to realise more fully how valuable the Q methodology was for helping not only to distill a range of perspectives in order to prioritise the aspects that were seen as important for making supported self-management work from different stakeholders' perspectives. But as you can see from the templates on the previous slide and the example quote shown here, the follow-up notes and discussions were particularly insightful for gleaning that better understanding of how participants believed specific mechanisms to work and what outcomes they led to. In the accompanying discussion that we had after the Q sorts, we were able to probe some of those ideas further and also to ask more about the influence of context, also posing thoughts to the participants about, well, what might happen if the context was different to the ones that they were familiar with or grounding their responses in. So not really testing ideas, but just more getting a more rounded sense about, is this something that we do need to think about ahead of the testing phase? And that was really helpful for helping us to set up those multi-directional CMO strings with opposing modes of action, or indeed rival theories. And we had more confidence in doing that than we had prior to the Q study with the ideas that had just emerged from the literature alone. And this is just a few examples of the quotations from either the written follow-up documents or the verbal discussions, and hopefully some of you can see where we were kind of coming from with linking up some of those CMO strings. So for example, that first one, we need to think outside the box. Some people may struggle to be creative, but we need to foster that. It links to flexibility. So that idea about working creatively also helped to lead to that more flexible working. Next slide, please, Jo. But let's link this back in with our theory development and what did Q bring to that process in the Realist study. And again, I'm really looking forward to hearing people's views and their experiences of this as well. Firstly, our experience was that the factors helped us to identify what those more salient ideas underpinning what supported self-management was to the people in our study. And given that huge variation in perspectives and interpretations and the general ambiguity about what supported self-management is, that was really helpful to try and get some consensus over that before we moved too far into developing the CMOCs. We didn't want to risk developing CMO strings and CMOC strings and program theories round about an idea of supported self-management that actually wasn't accurate or didn't reflect what people thought it was. The factors themselves in the Q methodology study were also useful for highlighting several main points that were critical to making supported self-management work. And those accompanying discussions and notes from the participants were really valuable for helping us to refine our ideas about what those CMOCs might look like. We started to create mind maps, as shown in this messy diagram here, and this sat on my whiteboard for at least 2 years. And I'm now thinking I might frame it and put it up in the office here because I quite like it, and I quite like going back to our initial kind of thinking and seeing where we've come from and where we got to in the end. And we started outlining some of these potentially linked CMOCs, and we wove back between the ideas that had emerged from the literature in the first phase of the work and the Q findings to start to firm up those CMOCs, mapping them and aligning them to the factor arrays from the Q methodology, but also our initial set of program theories where we could do that. And at this stage, we had far too many CMOCs. And with input from our PPI group, that's where we started to prioritise the programme theories around core areas identified within the factor descriptions. And so that helped to focus us, but it also meant that we included things like developing a person-centred ethos, the importance of that shared and consistent understanding of supported self-management, some things like autonomy, training and support, psychological safety, which was a real big one to come out of this work, and that enabled us to connect with some work that's not in supported self-management and stroke, but is about how teams work together. So we were able to go to that body of literature and look for some ideas around about that as well. And confidence for teams to work collaboratively with stroke survivors. That was a big thing that came out, that there was something there about how teams needed to feel confident in order to work flexibly and collaboratively with stroke survivors. And that idea of sharing power and responsibility for self-management and the importance of having time to reflect on and opportunities for skills development, which would enable that flexible and collaborative working and relationship building with stroke survivors so that they in turn had a good relationship safety system there in place where they could develop their own confidence and skills for self-management. And then we used all of these ideas to inform the development of the interview guide, where we tested out our theory ideas and our CMOCs. Next slide, please, Jo. So in summing up, before opening this up to further discussions, I wanted to just briefly reflect on what we felt was the value in using Q methodology in our Realist study and what we found particularly challenging along the way. So in terms of challenges, we were new to Q methodology, myself and Julie. Sorry, Jo, can you go back to the previous slide there? Thank you. And we were new to Realist methodologies as well, so we had a double whammy of learning to do It took a huge amount of time, and more time than perhaps we had originally anticipated. I think the whole process of programme theory development took more time than anticipated, with us being fairly naive to this. And I think next time around I'd be more mindful of this within a funding proposal or project plan. We did achieve it in the time that an extension thanks to COVID, but yeah, it was a lot of work and it was a tight timeline. I think I'd also like to have a firmer idea of the CMO strings ahead of the queue sorting process, just so that it helps cut through the wealth of data and the headaches that we perhaps experience trying to make some sense of that. And I'd be really interested to hear what others have to share on that, or how we might approach that and mitigate against the risk of being swamped in that data. However, in terms of the value, although each factor identified through the Q study has distinctive features, a common element across all the factors was that emphasis on a person-centred and individualised approach for supporting self-management and building a trusting and supportive relationship. And that was prioritised across all factors and really helped to ground us and move us forward with the core of what should be at the heart of our programme theories. And what we subsequently labelled those in the testing phase and ultimately after that was embedding an ethos of supported self-management, which focused on creating the conditions with the team or the organisation for practitioners to feel confident and capable to work flexibly and collaboratively. And also the second one was about building confidence, and that focused on what needs to happen within a supportive and collaborative relationship to ensure that stroke survivors remain in control of their self-management decision making and feel confident to do that. So it helped to really ground what those elements were in telling the overall story of those programme theories. And we were also able to identify what were aspects of the programme architecture from potential mechanisms of action, and that wasn't entirely clear through the literature to begin with. So I think the Q methodology was really helpful for just dissing some of that. And if we didn't do that, our programme theories might have looked a bit more muddled. So it really helped us to get to the nuances of what the mechanisms could be and how they might work. And others such as Kevin have written about the compatibility of Q methodology and realist approaches previously, and I think we would certainly agree with everything that's been written so far. They do seem to share similarities, since they both aim to understand those patterns or regularities within the data. So we definitely agree that these sit well together, but again, I'm interested to hear what others think and whether they are compatible or if they have a different take on that, and have a bit of discussion about that. Context is such a central tenet of realist approaches, and I think the Q sort statements allowed us to draw together that broader sphere of potential contexts and mechanisms from the knowledge base, and we could understand how different aspects of context might work or might trigger or stop the triggering of mechanisms. Participants were also drawing on their own experiences since they lived or worked in different contexts from each other. And so, for example, the practitioners all completed the Q sort in their teams or with people from the same health board area. So they were drawing on those external and organisational things that might have been similar. And that gave us direct insight into the context that they were prioritising the statements in. And this was quite illuminating to be able to understand how mechanisms and outcomes across the sample were influenced by those different aspects of local context. And I do think that this was more nuanced and concrete than we'd initially started out with from the literature review, and perhaps more nuanced and concrete than what we might have gleaned from one or two smaller stakeholder workshop sessions. Again, this being the first time that we've done this, and I've not got much to compare it to, but I'd be interested to know how this does compare to people's experiences of that traditional, more qualitative stakeholder involvement aspects. And I think using Q methodology also helped to foster those deeper insights into how we articulated those programme theories, which were beyond the ideas that we as researchers had initially come up with from the literature, and were informed by those multiple perspectives as well. And the prioritisation, finally, I think was a really important aspect that Q afforded, because those shared viewpoints helped us to see where to group or collapse or park ideas related to programme theories. And we do still have some ideas that we have shelved for now that we've not taken forward, but there is some mileage and perhaps going back to those in future research. And that was mostly a kind of pragmatic decision based on the fact that we had a limited funding period in which to get the work done, and unfortunately couldn't take as long as what we wanted over it. Next slide, please, Jo. And that pretty much sums up the experiences that we wanted to share today with you round about using Q in our Realist project. I do have a final slide which I would ask if you can move on to, please, Jo. And we touched on this earlier on, that this is a developing area. There's no set standards or agreement about how we involve stakeholders in realist studies, and no model for using or embedding Q methodology, or indeed other approaches within realist studies. So I'd be really interested to hear others' thoughts or indeed disagreements with how we undertook our work, and also in relation to some of the broader questions which I've put here on the screen. And I guess these have been questions that we've been grappling with, and as we have been undertaking our analysis and writing up of the project, again, these are things that spring to mind and I think would be useful for informing our discussions today. So so it's very much over to all of you now. Thank you. Thanks, Jo. You can stop sharing now if you like.
Except I can't. I don't know why. We have had so many problems today. Am I still sharing? Goodness me. No, stop. Right, okay, that took a while to do. So for those that have been watching the chat, you will know that we have had the biggest technical disaster I think that we've ever had, but we'll come on to that. So first of all, in true fashion, as you know, if we were in person face to face, we'd be giving the speaker a lovely round of applause now. So can we turn on cameras and mics and just give Lisa a round of applause for the wonderful talk that she's just delivered. So thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you, everyone. And I'm sorry for all the technical problems that all of you, I heard it pinging away and I just thought I'll just keep going. You'll tell me if I need to stop.
Yeah, so basically we have no idea what's happened, but it seems like about 10 people were stuck in an alternate cyber universe where they could see the chat but couldn't see or hear anything from us. So we tried. They obviously tried to leave and rejoin. We sent them links. We tried to Google. So I've got the iPad out, trying to work out as well. I'm communicating with Karen on WhatsApp. So I do have to confess, I need to watch the recording because I didn't take an awful lot in. We've never had any disasters like this. So if anyone else has ever had any disasters like this and got round them, please can you get in touch and let us know, because we would like to learn from this one. So I just want to know if there's any questions come through in the chat. If people have got questions that you'd like to pose to Lisa, then please do that. It's actually quite tough because of all the problems with trying to get people in to make sense of the chat. But I know, Lisa, you wanted to have a discussion with people about Q methodology. I suppose it's future as well, isn't it? It's thinking about, do we need more support space? I mean, there's lots of methodological papers come out in realist methods over the last few years, but not so many just specifically devoted to Q methodology. So I don't know if you want to open that out. I know Kev Harris is in the audience, so he might be a good person to put on the spot and bring into this conversation. I think Kev's just put his hand up anyway, so yeah.
And also Helen, I'm going to put you on the spot as well, if you don't mind, if there's any particular Q questions, but also because you're doing some work in this space, which I think is a little bit different to what we did in this project. So it would be great to just hear about how we can use Q differently, and the value that it brings, and if they are compatible.
Do either of you want to go first? I don't mind. You can.
Kev, do you want to come in first? You've got your hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. This is about the only tech bit that's gone all right, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I was saying, yeah, you're in need of a realist evaluation to understand the complexity of why this hasn't worked.
Like you need a
Yeah,
science degree.
yeah. I just wanted to say thank you, Lisa, for a great talk. And first and foremost, it's great to hear that there's other people out there, giving Q a go within the realist approach. It's fantastic to see. And I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. Lots of observations, lots of questions and reflections, because I've been using Q in a lot of my realist evaluations that I've been involved in recently. I suppose one of your questions that you had on your last slide was where within a realist evaluation does Q sit? I think that's a really good question and discussion in itself that you could speak all day about. For me personally, I think it sits within the whole 3 phases of a realist evaluation in terms of program theory development, or the development of explanatory accounts, however you want to frame phase 1, and then phase 2, the testing, and then obviously theory refinement. So for example, within phase 1, within Q, where Q comes into that is the concourse, which is kind of like the universal, the phenomenon of statements, or what represents that subjectivity of whatever is under examination, is a great starting point, and the concourse can really help inform the development of the program theories, or vice versa. So therefore, what you are testing in terms of your Q set for the P set becomes iterative and really very much in line with that testing emphasis of what realist evaluation is about in phase 2. So that testing of the Q set becomes very valuable then, in terms of being nicely aligned to those theories. And then what comes out, which is my most favorite part of Q, I don't like I was going to ask you how you get around the factor analysis and whether or not you use the old clunky PQ method, which is what we tend to use at times, which is a nightmare. Is my favorite part is a qualitative interpretation, which is kind of like what comes out of the testing of the Q set, and that kind of takes us into that learning of how does it really work for people, or but how does that subjectivity pan out, which takes us into the refining stage. So I just wanted to particularly cover that bit, in that I think it is very iterative and it feeds itself across that whole cycle. So yeah, that was the first thing I would say. Lots of other things as well, but I'll just leave it there for the minute.
Yeah, it'd be great to chat at some point more about it all, Kev, and unpack it on. I think you're right, and I can see, even though we've positioned it within the theory development phase of this project, I can see that it does have those development, refining elements to it, even within that. So I think that's really interesting. I have to say that, being a qualitative researcher, it was more the qualitative comments and the discussions that I was inevitably drawn to, but I just loved the way that offered that layer of explanation and interpretation for the statistical analysis. I thought that was really, really helpful. And Helen, you were involved in the kind of statistical analysis side of that. I don't know, from your perspective, how you felt the qualitative comments kind of added to that. This is obviously your area of expertise, being a Q methodologist.
Yeah. So as Lisa said, I am a Q methodologist / economist. So I come from it more from the numbers side. So in terms of like Kev's comments about how we actually, processed all the data and stuff, we use KenQ. We're ahead of the game, Kev. And for anybody, I see some people have asked about in the chat about, some readings and stuff, and I'm sure, well, definitely the paper that Kev's just added a link to in the chat, but we can also kind of, share some other papers that are much more about the introduction to Q methodology, and then thinking about how it kind of links into Realist. And while I obviously come from a numbers side, more than than Lisa does, I also see it as a very iterative process. So it's about the combination of of the factor analysis saying, well, we can only have this many viewpoints, that's all the data supports. And that's a good thing about Q, because it kind of does show you, there are different views that exist, and there's no kind of getting away from that, which makes it different to kind of other types of qualitative evaluation. or qualitative methods, but then we can use the qualitative data to be able to kind of enrich that and actually have that discussion. And I'm also just kind of keeping an eye on the kind of chat questions. So somebody said that you used interviews after the Q sorting process, and did we do kind of realist interviews? And we didn't as part of that, because we actually treated this Q study actually as a very kind of straightforward traditional Q study, just kind of wrapping the realist kind of around it in the kind of initial design, and then into the kind of actual how we then use that to refine the program theories. But the actual Q study is very as you normally do a Q study. So the questions and the interviews that we do after that are much more about, you know, asking people, as Lisa said, you know, why did you place the statements that you did, you know, why were they most important, why were they least important, and trying to kind of get an understanding of people's whole process, because Q, you know, the interpretation of the factors is about the placing of all statements relative to each other. I could talk about Q methodology literally all day. I'm very excited. So mostly that's just to say we didn't use a realist kind of interview technique. However, Lisa did mention that I'm involved in another project where we're using Q as part of a very, very large realist evaluation. And we are using the Q study specifically to look at mechanisms in that project. And because we've done a lot of the kind of upfront work on the program theory development, and I think we might then also follow that with more realist style interviews. So that's a kind of different step for us. I think Kev's got his hand up again.
Interesting. It's interesting as well, though, just when you said that, Helen, that I guess the Q can be used to either look at context or mechanisms or outcomes or all three. I mean, I guess, you know, we're at that stage where there's different ways to use it, and I've never thought just before about it being for one thing, but that's interesting about it being used to look at the mechanisms in your study. I'd be interested to hear how that goes. Yeah. Kev, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, is that okay? I was just wanted to build on what Helen was talking about. I think it's Emma's question around where the interviews come into the Q sorting process, for example. And I was just going to say that I think first and foremost, where not many people are using Q within a realist evaluation, it's kind of like a very much an exploratory, you know, endeavor where there's no kind of like Q police out there. Well, there might be, but they're, you know, like the CMO police who say, oh no, you must do it this way, or it's not being done correctly, all that sort of stuff. So I think it's you use it in whatever way. Like the interviews, you can use interviews to help inform the concourse or to substantiate the concourse, which then informs the statements. Or one of the things that a couple of my PhD students are doing is that they kind of done their factor analysis and they've got their holistic narratives, which have tested the statements essentially. And basically what comes out of the factor analysis are these, what Watson Stenner calls these holistic narratives, which the way that we position it, and these are kind of like the refined theories for those subgroups or those factors around how they see the, you know, the program that's being evaluated or whatever the phenomenon is, for example. And then it becomes iterative, where, for example, you can build interview schedules that are realist informed around those narratives and then present them as theories back to your stakeholders that fit into that subgroup, where you say, okay, this is my theory, or this is what's come out of this. What do you think? And then you mobilize the Manzano process, whether it's an interview or obviously her most recent paper, which is a focus group. I just wanted to build on that.
I like the idea of mobilizing a Manzano process. I think there's something that needs to be explored around that. And I think there's just a couple of things in the chat that I just wanted to just to post to you, and maybe all three of you as well. Eleanor Golder has just said that she thinks that Q methodology could be really helpful for identifying the most salient aspects of program theory. And I have to say, I think that is one of the most challenging things when you've got reams and reams and reams and maybe several offices worth full of data. Trying to prioritize and work out which is the most important one is a challenge anyway in realist research. So I think if there is a tool out there that can help you with that, then maybe that's something that we can consider. What are your takes on that?
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree with that. I mean, in our case, our Realist project has come up with 2 programme theory areas that we have concentrated on, and one is about the organisation and what needs to, what's happening there to enable practitioners to feel confident, and the other one was very much about the patient-provider relationship and what's happening to help stroke survivors to feel confident to do self-management. So you've got the delivery of self-management and the doing of self-management and what that looks like. But there's so much more there. We had loads of stuff around links to third sector and integration and lots more aspects that are involved in part of the delivery or receiving of supported self-management, but we had to just kind of prioritise it into these kind of areas. And the Q was really helpful because people were telling us, well, what is most important? We thought, right, these are the most important areas that we can focus on within this and come up with something meaningful that actually will help to inform or change practice or be useful to practitioners or stroke survivors. So from my experience, I think it was really helpful for that. There's obviously more that we could do, but yes, certainly it was helpful for that.
So thanks, Lisa. And I think I can understand that. You know, even with our own research, we try to be pragmatic, but you do get so much data, and we use stakeholders, not in a Q methodology way, but we do use stakeholders to help us prioritise the ones that we think are the most important. But I think this feels like it's a more methodologically robust approach. Yeah, rather than us say, you know, I feel like there's a potential for us to say, oh, do you think this is important? You know, so I think a more fluid use of stakeholders. I think that there's certainly elements to be explored, I think, around the use of stakeholders. And I think Anna Manzana's covering stakeholders in a talk that she's doing for the French group next month. So that could be an interesting one to pick up on for other people.
Yeah.
Nikki
really
Harris has, Nikki, are you still in the room? Do you want to come on? If you are, hello, do you want to ask your question? Hello, how are you?
Yeah, thank you. I thought that was fascinating. I'm fine, thank you. I am not a Q methodologist, but I've done realist evaluation. And one of the challenges I found was that kind of limitless infinity of it when you start to dig into something and all those rabbit holes you go down. And it struck me that at the beginning, that consensus exercise, concourse, whatever you called it, was a really key phase to limiting what you're doing. But if you're going to limit at that point, how do you then incorporate the new insights, the theory gleaning, that evolution? Are you changing those bits on the cards, for instance, as you go, or for consistency you keep them all the same, but then you are ignoring the new stuff that is coming through? And I just wondered how you incorporate that really iterative, exploratory bit where you're trying to understand things into a realist process, because part of the philosophical underpinning is that actually there may well be a reality out there. We can't ever know the whole of that reality, so go and explore. How does that fit with what feels like a slightly more rigid structure of Q methodology?
Mm-hmm. I think you're right in that it does force us to be a bit more rigid, and I think that's where we saw our theory testing stage as kind of opening that back out again. So I think we thought the Q methodology would be really helpful for articulating initially this is how we think things work, and then opening that back out. And actually in the Realist interviews that we did, which, as Helen said, were Realist led ones, we were actually explored some other ideas as well when people contributed things like emotional burden and compassion fatigue and things like that. So that helped us to kind of open out again a little bit on actually some new ideas and the ways that teams worked as well. I think the depth that we got from the Realist interviews, the focus groups round about that, we probably didn't have that depth at this level with the Q. So I think that was really helpful for just kind of unpacking that and exploring some new areas again. So we definitely saw our Realist interviews as being that bit where we found some new ideas and aimed to explore things a little bit more, rather than just being kept to what we had prioritised to begin with.
That answers
I don't know if that answers your question, Nikki.
Well, it's a start. You see, I've been listening to you and I've been thinking, oh, with these projects that I know that are coming up, I'm thinking, oh, I could incorporate a bit of that and a bit of that. But it's then how
Yeah.
do you do that in a
Yes.
coherent, effective way and keep it within time, within budget, and just within your, what you can physically
Absolutely.
do. So, yeah.
On that
Absolutely.
note, so if we just take that little bit, that sort of endpoint from Nikki, would you do it again? Would you use Q again?
Yes, I would use Q again. I would use it again. And I'm not just saying that because Helen's there staring at me and will come down the corridor. No, I would use it again. I think I would, next time, I think I would have a better understanding about how Q could connect to the realist work. I think when we started it at first, we thought it would be a really good approach, but we probably didn't have a sense about how it all links together. And I think now, having been through it, we could see that. So yes, I would. I think I would probably have greater clarity as I started it next time. And it's an interesting idea that Helen's raised about whether you use the Q to explore particular bits of CMOCs or all of them. So yeah, I'd be interested to think more about what that might look like in a future study.
Yeah, I can see some methods papers that need to come out of this to help people get a greater understanding, I think, of what it is you've done and why and what you might do differently. We've just had a question from Anna Manzano in the chat, but she can't talk. She's in a shared office. So she said, one of the questions at the end was about stakeholder involvement, and maybe you can expand a bit more about how you did decide who to involve in the Q methodology sessions and whether you had some flexibility. Awesome question, Anna.
That is a great question, Anna. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did have some flexibility. So we had picked out our 4 case study areas, mostly because what we wanted to get was that differences of context. We have some stroke audit data here in Scotland that shows that some people are delivering supported self-management services really well, and they have pathways in place for being able to do that. And then in other health board areas, they're maybe not so forward or progressive with those plans. And that was our kind of starting point, was, well, what's happening in these areas that's different? And how can people deliver the same principles of a service and make sure that it's what people need in these different areas where the strategies for delivering them and the mechanisms might be different because of the context? So that's kind of where we started it from, which was quite a naive starting point, I think, for our realist work, and we've learned so much more since. But in answer to your question, we wanted to recruit community teams largely. So we had some flexibility, but not too much flexibility over that, because we wanted to take them as a team, because we wanted to understand, we thought they've already got some dynamics within their teams for the most part. They work in the same areas, they're drawing on the same kind of things. We wanted to get that level of interaction there to understand, how does that team operate? And I think even that was useful as well when we were watching the discussions between them at the ends, and we got a sense about what those dynamics potentially looked like as well, which helped to add to our ideas about context. The stroke survivors, we were looking for 5 stroke survivors from each kind of area to take part in this. And essentially those were people that were already known to the community rehab team. So they identified potential people who could take part. I think we'd said that they should be 3 to 6 months post-stroke, but largely kind of back trying to either engaging in rehab still or moving on and trying to get back to their life after stroke. So we didn't put any particular restrictions on that, other than they weren't to be just newly discharged after having a stroke. And that was really how we selected the participants. And we, in the health board areas for the community teams and for the managers, we just issued that invitation to say, through our local collaborators in each site, here's who we're looking for, here's who we need, can you issue this information sheet? And then that's who we got back. But we did want the community team, and we wanted managers who were leading community teams who were at that slightly more strategic level with that kind of oversight. We wanted that different perspective from the on the ground perspective, and then the actually what are people getting perspective as well.
Does that help, Hannah? You can put some more in the chat if you want to follow up. But I think choosing stake, I don't know, are you covering this in your session when you do the session for the French group? I can't even remember the name of it. That's why I keep calling it the French group. Sorry to the French group. I think Anne's been posting information about it. I think it's an interesting one of how to choose stakeholders for the research and why, and what benefits you might get, you know, because you do get a lot of what you need, somebody, you know, who's diverse, but how much do we actually put into checking out our stakeholders when we use them in the research, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
And certainly something that I think could benefit from more reflection. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to explore. We've got about 10 minutes left, so happy to take some more questions from the floor or just generally have more discussions. Oh, someone's just come on. Elizabeth.
Hi, it's Lizzie
Hello.
here from Norway. Although originally from New Zealand, you might gather from my accent.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very Norwegian.
So my question is about it's a mixed methods approach, but you would assume there's probably quite a small n when it comes to the method. And it reminds me a little bit of a discrete choice experiment. And I wondered if anyone has played with this idea of a bigger sample size. I really like the idea of doing the kind of assessment, like letting them do it physically and then having interviews afterwards. I thought that was really complimentary, but I wondered if anyone has any thoughts or reflections on how it could be combined with the discrete choice experiment. Maybe Helen has an opinion over.
Yeah. Please come in, Helen. That'd be great to hear your expertise on that.
So we have used Q as part of the DCE to develop the attributes and levels. So we've done that a couple of times as a kind of, not to replace, but to kind of enhance that kind of pre-work that you would do to develop your attributes and levels for a DCE, a discrete choice experiment. I think as well, so you're right, like the N in a Q study is small, and I think maybe also kind of touching back on the previous question around the stakeholders. So you choose people to take part in your Q study on the basis that they will have, you know, differing and strong opinions. So it's a very poster sample. You know, generally we speak to between 15 and 40 people, because all you're looking to do with the Q study is identify different views that exist on your topic of interest. So you don't need lots and lots of people to be saying the same thing to kind of, once you've identified and you've got enough, you know, a critical mass, should I say, or kind of, you know, that kind of data saturation idea of, you know, we've now got enough people, we can form a view, we think it's understandable based on the kind of comments that they're making. Stop looking for people like that. And we want to just make sure that we've kind of got enough to identify what views, you know, might exist. Because what we can't make any claims about from a Q study is representativeness in a population. So we can't then go back and say, you know, factor one in our case was predominantly stroke survivors, and therefore all stroke survivors think like this. That's kind of not what we're, you know, what we're doing. That's not what we're looking to do. You need a different type of study afterwards. You need a different type of survey that builds on that to be able to say, well, what is the prevalence of those views and how do they relate to other kind of characteristics about the people? So that's a kind of slightly different angle to it there. Sorry, I'm going well off on your question here, Elizabeth. And then, I mean, we have done Q studies with bigger numbers because we've done international Q studies with lots of different partners. So, you know, with hundreds of people rather than, you know, tens of people. But it doesn't really make that much difference beyond just now you've got a lot more people who tell us the same thing about the same factors. So that's kind of how we've used it in different stages.
Does that help, Lizzie?
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks for the talk and the questions. Bye.
Thanks for joining. Hopefully we'll have less technical issues next time. Kev's made a comment in the chat. Kev, do you want to come on and explain it? Because I think it's relevant to the discussion that Anna was having with Lisa over chat about stakeholders.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about in one of the papers that I shared in the chat around just the pragmatics of Q and evaluation I think is important around the stakeholder engagement. And sometimes when we do an evaluation for a client and we talk about and they say, what methods are you going to use and why are you going to use those methods? Sometimes it's quite hard to explain Q without, switching people off, which sometimes happens with a realist evaluation, but it comes down to, how clear are you and how plain speaking can you be in terms of how you bring it across. But there's something about that, I think, in terms of people, the fostering use, and the whole point here is about trying to cultivate learning around what comes out of those factors is one point, and then there's the other point is around those participants within the actual P set and how they engage, and that something about inclusivity there in terms of their understanding of their participation. Because a lot of people, whenever I've done Q, they're like, oh my god, what was this? Where do I rank this, or where do I put this? And it's very new to a lot of people compared to the usual conventional methods. So I think it's just one thing for us to consider as we take it forward.
In the last couple of minutes, I just have a question. If you've got someone who, I suppose, Lisa, a few years ago when she was putting together the grant proposal, perhaps new to Realist and or new to Q, what would your top tips be for somebody who is proposing to join what looks to me like two complex approaches and getting them to, I don't know if you can hear the dog, sorry, there's a lorry going past, getting these two approaches to synthesize rather than just, bash off each other? What tips would you give people? Any of you?
I think one tip, and I kind of feel this, even from this community, is reaching out to others that have done this kind of work. And certainly early on when we met Kev, we had a chat about, well, how might we do this? And I think at that point we probably were still quite unclear about how we might do it. But I think knowing who's working in that space and who's done that, I think creating that network with people is helpful. And I think now we're in a really good position where there maybe are more people trying to combine approaches. It's maybe moved on a little bit in the last 2 or 3 years since we kind of started, and certainly when we put the funding proposal together we didn't know about Kev's work. So I think it's just maybe having those people that you can reach out to. I think having expertise on the team certainly has helped, and I don't know that we could have done all of this without Helen kind of guiding us through what we were doing and keeping us right. And similarly, I think from the Realist side, having those experts and that expertise on your team, I think has been invaluable for us.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Lisa. And I think, we do have, on the projects that I'm involved in, although I have experience in Realist methods, we actually have Realist experts as well sitting on the wider project team. It's really nice for me because I get the opportunity to bounce things off and have Realist discussions. But having done the PhD with less of that, I can certainly appreciate, and you get answers to things very quickly then as well.
Yes, absolutely.
So I don't know if anyone else has got anything else to say, but we've only got 4 minutes left, so I'm happy to hang on if anyone's got any burning questions. If anyone's got any ideas of sessions that they'd like us to run, please either put them in the chat or send us a message and we can try and see if we can find speakers. But I'd just like to say thank you again, Lisa. It's been lovely to hear about it. And if you know the people who were stuck in this weird cyberspace room, please apologise to them, and we will get the recording out as soon as we can so that they can eventually watch it, assuming it's recorded us and not the weird room that has been existing. So we won't know that until we start. But yeah, sorry for everyone who's had any problems. And thanks to everyone who's come. We really appreciate it. Hopefully see you all next month.
Thanks, everyone.